and welcome to the X22 Report. My name is Dave, and this is episode 140. And the title of this episode is Governments Are Strategically Positioning Themselves for the Economic Collapse. And on Friday, I reported on something that's going to happen this fall or early winter, where I call it part one of the collapse, and I laid that out. Saturday, I talked about the power grid drill that is going to happen in November, and now there is even more news and more warnings that are coming out, and certain things that don't make sense, and this will just add to what I have been saying, and we will go through everything in this report. But let's get into the economic collapse news first, and then we'll get into what I believe will happen during this fall or early winter. Now, Spanish banks, their bad loan ratios are edging higher, and it really is not a surprise because when you have people out of work, people who can't make payments, we're going to see more bad loans. I mean, it just all makes sense. And the more people who are unemployed, the worse it gets. The more that governments and banks have to try to borrow or do whatever they have to do to survive, and it's just unsustainable. It just cannot be done. And we see this as a perfect example of Greece because that was test one. Let's try bailouts. Okay, we did the first bailout. The mainstream media, the government said everything's fine, but it really wasn't. They needed multiple bailouts. And every time they get a bailout, things get worse. More people get laid off. More unemployment numbers go up, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse. So then they did test number two. Let's try this in Cyprus. Instead of bailouts, let's try bail-ins. Well, they froze everyone's account. They put everyone in capital controls where they can't touch any of their money for just 2 weeks, they said, and we're only going to take 8 to 10%. But, of course, as governments always do, they lied and they took 47%. And guess what? People are still under capital controls over 120 days now. So bailout didn't work, bail-in didn't work. So these two tests, they realize it doesn't matter where they take the money, because if you don't have revenue coming in, you can't support the system. And as more and more people lose work, it gets worse and worse and worse. And I mean, we're seeing this here in the U.S. Now, Saks is reporting weak second quarter sales. They have deeper losses, and this says Saks Inc. on Monday reported a deeper than expected second quarter loss after disappointing sales on shoes and handbags, and it forced the luxury retailer to mark down their prices because even the wealthier people are having a tough time affording these expensive shoes and bags. And we're seeing this not just happen in the wealthy sector, we're seeing it starting to happen all over the place. We're seeing it in Macy's, Nordstrom's, Kohl's, Walmart, Costco, Office Max, and we're seeing all of these stores report lower sales. We're even seeing more stores report that they're actually closing stores. Best Buy, Barnes & Noble, Radio Shack. Well, JCPenney, we know that's just a disaster. That store is just going bye-bye. And we're seeing this happen all over the place. And from all of this, I mean, we're seeing it's the destruction of the entire country and especially the middle class. And just some statistics about this is 76% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. 27% of Americans have no savings at all. 46% of Americans have less than $800 in savings right now. And most Americans right now are working as temps and or have more than one job just to make ends meet, especially with food getting pricier, products shrinking down, so you're getting less for your money, and this way the manufacturers don't have to show that the prices are actually going up, so they're just making things smaller. But for those things that they, like milk, they can't say it's a gallon because, and try to shrink it and still say it's a gallon, so they leave it as a gallon. But you see the price of milk going up. I mean, it's already up where I am at $3.89. I know you can get it cheaper in other places, but the place I'm tracking it has it at $3.89. Last month it was $3.85. Before that, I think I had it at $3.79. So the price is continually going up, up, up. Okay, let's move on here. Now, the U.S. military depends on Egypt, and a lot of congressmen are saying, let's cut aid to Egypt. And do I believe that's going to happen? No. They need Egypt. They control Egypt. They control Saudi Arabia. They control most of the Middle East countries. They are there in place to protect the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency and the private Western central banks. And they're just not going to cut off aid to Egypt. And this report says the U.S. military is heavily dependent on Egypt to move personnel and equipment to Afghanistan and around volatile parts of the Middle East, complicating U.S. efforts to place pressure on the Egyptian military in the wake of its violent crackdown on protesters. Egypt has been a cornerstone for the U.S. military presence in the Middle East. And about 35 to 45 U.S. Fifth Fleet naval ships pass through the Suez Canal annually, including carrier strike groups. And most of the time, Egypt has allowed U.S. warships to be expedited, which often means they get ahead of other ships and they're allowed to pass through. Why? Because the U.S. government controls Egypt. When you give a country billions of dollars, they'll do whatever you want them to do, just like Saudi Arabia. And this goes on to say, if Egypt cut off its airspace and canal access, the U.S. military would face heavier costs. And not just that, they control the military, they give them aid, and they protect the U.S. dollar, the oil, the private Western central bank, from being overrun and being done to it like what Iran and Syria has done, where they do not trade in the U.S. dollar. Now, Syria warns of new advances by Al-Qaeda, and we're hearing a lot about Al-Qaeda pushing and going into other areas like Beirut and bombing there to bring the fight back to Syria. And we see that Al-Qaeda is moving into Syria. It seems like it's trying to get things going inside Syria with more people coming in. And many of the camp's residents that where Al-Qaeda is coming in were forced to flee to a neighboring Palestine camp when hostilities took place. And some of these Al-Qaeda are starting to preach their versions of the Quran, and at some point their gentle teachings become more aggressive and it gets out of hand. And it seems like this Al-Qaeda presence all throughout the Middle East. Of course, we know that the U.S. government had a terrorist threat about Al-Qaeda, and as we know, Al-Qaeda is a CIA-paid group. And so we pay Al-Qaeda to be terrorists. Well, I should say the U.S. government, central bankers, CIA, pay Al-Qaeda to be terrorists. And then we put a report up there that we need to be afraid of these people that we're paying to do this. Does it make sense? No, of course it doesn't. But for those people who don't understand what's going on, they think Al-Qaeda are real terrorists. Now, what is happening all around the world? Now, South Korea, in preparation for World War III, is having drills with the U.S. simulating invasion by North Korea. South Korea launched a military drill Monday with the United States against a simulated North Korean invasion, and it involved more than 80,000 South Korean and U.S. troops in this drill. Now, there was a report, and this goes to a couple reports that I did a while back, maybe maybe 4 or 5 reports back, where I reported on that the U.S. government was training paid mercenaries to establish a no-fly zone in Syria with other countries. And I went down a whole list of saying how this was going to take place, and now we learn that the new CENTCOM underground war room is right by Syria, and it is put in place for the war in Syria. And Martin Dempsey, chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, was in Amman this week to inaugurate the CENTCOM's Forward Command in Jordan, manned by 273 U.S. officers. And the place where it is secret. It's underground. And this installation is bomb and missile proof against a possible Syrian attack. The U.S. Air Force Command Section is in direct communication with the U.S., Israeli, Jordanian, and Saudi Air Force headquarters, ready for an order by President Barack Obama to impose a partial no-fly zone over Syrian airspace. This is going forward. There will be war in Syria. Russia has been training for this, has been doing drills, has placed missiles in Armenia, and has been modernizing the base there. They have ships, and we see that this is waiting for some type of an event. And General Dempsey says that this operation can continue well into next year or beyond, because again, Russia and China back Syria. So everything is in place for what is coming. Okay. Now, coming back to the U.S., Ray Kelly, who's in line to become, one of the people to become the head of DHS, is arguing about the stop and frisk policy, where he's saying that it is not unconstitutional, that it is avoided many crimes, and they stopped many crimes by doing this. And he's saying that we need to do this, and the officers have to violate the U.S. Constitution to make it safer for the people. And we see that the states that are on the verge of bankruptcy are implementing draconian laws. In New York, they have, if you believe a gun is illegal, report your neighbor. You receive $500. Even if you have no proof, they will start an investigation. They also have the gun confiscation that's going on now, where they're looking at medical records. Even though if someone has no history of crime, violence, or anything on their record, if they taking a medication or they have psychological, they visited a psychologist or a psychiatrist, they are asking for their permit back and to get rid of their weapon, which is completely unconstitutional, and it violates the Second Amendment and many other rights in the Constitution. And we also see the stop and frisk, where they violate the Fourth Amendment, where they just stop people and they search them and take whatever you have on your person and remove it from you if they think it's suspicious. And there is no warrant, there's no probable cause. It's just like, hey, let's stop that person and frisk them, and let's see what they have on them. Now, in New Jersey, which is another state which is on the verge of bankruptcy, is also creating these draconian laws, especially for weapons. And Chris Christie came out the other day, and I reported on this, that they created a new law that you can't get a FID card to own a weapon if you're on the terrorist watch list. Now, The terrorist watch list, of course, is secret, so you don't know if you're on it or not. You can't get off of it. You can't see the list, and you don't know you're on it. But if you're on it, you can't get a weapon. So in reality, they can put anyone they want on there and just say nobody has weapons. To take this a step further, he wants to have an identification card for the purchase of all ammunition, and he wants to use a smart card which will ID you on the ammunition that you purchase, which violates the Second Amendment, of course, because the Second Amendment allows you to bear arms, and arms means weapons or ammunition or armaments shall not be infringed, shall not be limited, shall not be encroached on. And I'm sorry, placing a ID card to buy ammo is limiting, and it's encroaching on, and it shall not be violated, and they are violating the Second Amendment. Okay, now, Americans say that the oversight of the U.S. spying is inadequate. Well, of course it is. The reason why the oversight is inadequate, because we have to think about what our spy agencies have been doing. The NSA is not informing the Congress, which we know from Amash, not informing the American people, not cooperating. They're lying about what they're doing. They fired around 1,000 administrators, replacing them with computers so no one can squeal on them anymore. And why would an agency do all this? Because they're doing something they're not supposed to. They're doing something that violates the Fourth Amendment. They're doing something which we, the people, are protected by the Fourth Amendment, and they know this, and this is why they're lying. They're firing the people that they think might squeal and tell, just like Snowden did, tell what they're doing. The people ask, when they ask questions, they lie. They don't inform Congress on what they're doing. So the whole thing has been put together to spy on Americans, to place them into lists, to get investment ideas, to steal patents, to blackmail people, and this is all a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Now, way back when the Boston bombing happened, the DHS had a kill switch which killed the cell towers and didn't allow people to communicate with each other. And back then, there was an article about a kill switch, and what the DHS didn't realize is that people could still take pictures with their phone, and when the cell towers turned on, they were able to transmit these pictures, which kind of messed up their entire false flag event. And just to bring this up, recently there was an article that talked about the Texas fertilizer plant and the explosion that caused the fertilizer plant to go up was external. That's what the new report says. And I had a video that actually you heard a missile hit the fertilizer plant, because what was happening is everyone was taking pictures at the time of the Boston bombing, transmitting it all around. It messed up their original story of gun loving extremists, because the gun bill was being voted on at the same exact time. That's why it was a black powder bomb. So they needed a distraction for one day. Fertilizer plant blew up. That was plastered all over the news for one day. The next day, it was back to the Boston bombing. They had a whole new story about Muslims, Al-Qaeda, and everything else to bring that story back in. And what we're seeing now is Apple has just filed a patent that will allow the phone to be turned off completely if the DHS needs to do it. It will not only be Apple phones, it will be every single phone. This way they will stop everyone from not just communicating, but taking pictures and having these problems. I said this before. The central bankers, government, need to do two things. They need to have the control of the creation of money, which they do, and they need the control of the flow of information, which they do on the mainstream media level. But the internet and the smartphones, they do not. And they are trying to crack down on this, and that's why you see CISPA still pending in the Senate. You see other laws that are pending to all crack down and eventually remove the alternative media, remove the people's ability to take pictures, and this is why this is happening, because they need control of the internet and your smartphone to complete the full control of everything. And right now they do not have it. Now, I wanted to get into what is going to happen again in this fall, early winter. Now, we understand the Fed has just reached the $2 trillion of Treasury bonds on its books. And what this says here is that they, in was it August 7th, they own 1.99 trillion, and now they reached 2.001 trillion August 14th, 7 days later. And the breakdown, okay, the $2 trillion in Treasury securities now owned by the Fed equals 16.7% of the U.S. government's debt held by the public. Another $5.6 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities is owned by foreign entities. After the Fed, entities on mainland China are the largest owners of the U.S. government debt, holding only $1.27 trillion. And as we know, the Chinese are starting to unload their Treasury bonds. Same thing with Japan, and other foreign nations are starting to unload their Treasury bonds. But let's take this a step further and see what else is going on in the world that will lead up to this fall-winter Part 1 collapse. Now, the United States and Russia, now we know the United States and the Middle East countries make up OPEC, okay? And Russia produces about 653 billion cubic meters of gas in 2012, while the U.S. produced 651 billion cubic meters, making them the top two producers in the world. Now, paralleling the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, the New York Times calls it a gas OPEC. GECF is a bloc of countries whose mission is to fend off U.S. and Western power dominance of the global gas trade. There are 13 countries that make up the GECF, and these include Russia, Iran, Bolivia, Venezuela, Libya, Algeria, and others. So we have the Western central bankers owning OPEC, and then we have this bloc of countries, the GECF, and they're both fighting to be the dominant gas producers. And this is the new 21st century gas Cold War between U.S. and Russia. So we're seeing this start to happen here. And the other thing we're seeing now is, you know, we heard about the real estate, how it's doing so well and everything's going perfectly and the housing market is fantastic. Obama was on his campaign trail to let all the Americans know that the housing market is returning. But we know that mortgage applications have been falling. We know that the traffic to new construction, reported by D.R. Horton and others, have been falling. We are now seeing the sales of homes fall. We realize that most of the housing purchases are being purchased in cash, and those houses that are purchased are multi-family homes, and they are not single-family homes, and those homes are being purchased by hedge funds and other investment groups, and they are propping up the real estate market. and they're finding that Freddie and Fannie are now, doing some type of tricky accounting and not showing what they really have on their books. And this goes on to say that the tape are already actively being priced in, although certainly not fully, for a catalyst on when the untaper talk will start. Look for the GSEs to return to their old sorry shape. That will be the warning light for when the Fed will actively contemplating how to boost QE once more. And we are going to see this happen because it looks like with the amount of treasuries and they're on the Fed's books, with the talk of taper, with the central banks telling all central banks to start to taper because they're creating bubbles, and also now that Fannie and Freddie, we're seeing that they have a lot of unaccounted for losses on their books. But let's go further now. Now the Fed just came out and tells big banks to improve capital planning. And this goes on to say that big banks must improve the way they determine how much capital they need to withstand any future crisis, the U.S. Federal Reserve said, citing observations from regulators' periodic testing on the bank health. And there are some banks that are not prepared, and also they don't go into what happens if interest rates rise, if there are bank runs, if the stock market drops 20 to 50%. They don't include that in their stress test on the banks. Now, the Al-Qaeda militants urges attacks on U.S. diplomats. An American Al-Qaeda militant has called for more attacks on Western diplomats in the Arab world, praising the killers of the U.S. ambassador in Libya on September 11th last year. Now, we are seeing this start to emerge. We know that the U.S. government started off the scare tactics with Al-Qaeda in the Middle East, where they shut down all the U.S. embassies, they got U.S. citizens out of the area, and they continued their drone strikes in Yemen. They are trying to maintain control in the Middle East, but they kept everyone scared and afraid. They put up a travel advisory up until the end of August. Now, Al-Qaeda now, there's news that they're targeting European rail networks, and this goes on to say that Al-Qaeda is plotting attacks on Europe's high-speed rail networks, and the extremist group could plant explosives on trains and tunnels or sabotage tracks and electrical cabling. Now, we have that right there. They are pushing the Al-Qaeda agenda forward. But let's move on a little bit more. There was another report that states that nuclear reactors are vulnerable to terrorism. Now, there's about 107 nuclear reactors in the United States that are not protected from terrorist attacks, according to the Defense Department Commission report released Thursday. The report by the Nuclear Proliferation Prevention Project at the University of Texas warns that the current security required of civilian-operated reactors fails to safeguard against airplane attacks, rocket-propelled grenades, and more than small handful of attackers. And this goes on to say there are 104 nuclear power reactors and 3 research reactors, none of which are protected against a 9/11 style terrorist attack. Now keep that in mind, 9/11 style terrorist attack. And Alan J. Cooperman went on to say that this leaves U.S. nuclear facilities vulnerable to credible terrorist threats of theft of bomb-grade material and sabotage that could cause a massive meltdown and release of radiation. Okay, now we see Al-Qaeda in the Middle East. We had this huge warning all the way up to August 30th of travel advisory. They locked down the embassies. They're pushing Al-Qaeda throughout the Middle East, trying to bring the war into Syria. We have ships standing by outside of the Gulf of Aden and the Persian Gulf, 2 aircraft carriers and another warship. We also see that they have an underground bunker set up with 273 officers, 1,000 troops standing by, roughly around 3,000 paid mercenaries to go into Syria with other countries to establish a no-fly zone. We understand that Freddie and Fannie have been cooking the books, and they have much, much more losses than they're reporting. We understand that the Fed is buying up all the toxic real estate and monetizing the debt through treasury bonds, and they are $2 trillion worth of treasury bonds. Japan and China are dumping their treasury bonds at this time, and other foreign nations. Now, what's happening is, I said that and we also have September 30th is the end of the fiscal year to provide weapons to the rebels, because the budget and the ends for that, and they would have to go back to Congress and redo this. We also have the gun bill, the UN Arms Treaty, and the CISPA bill pending in the Senate as of right now. And believe me, there's a whole list of other things, but I'm just highlighting just what we have right here. And I talked about cyber attacks. So we know that there's a New York power grid cyber attack drill taking place in November. That was reported by the New York Times. And we've seen that the Syrian Electronic Army has been cyber attacking CNN, Washington Post, and the U.S. government, along with the United Kingdom, European nations, Australia, Canada, and other places have also been reporting cyber attacks. And this has been going on for a year and a half, and they talked about, the power grid and the infrastructure, water, all susceptible to cyber attacks, and the grid would go down, and also that banks are susceptible to these cyber attacks, and the only nations that could do this are advanced nations like Syria, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China. And just recently, New York Times went down the troll. They're saying it's human error, and what happened was they made an update to their servers and the backup servers at the same time, and the whole system went down. I'm sorry, that's just ridiculous. When you're doing an upgrade or applying a patch to any server, you never do it to your main server out of the blue and the backup server at the same exact time. You always have a test bed of servers that you do first. You keep your backup servers on the standby with no upgrades. You upgrade your original server, and you always have redundant failover servers so outages like this don't happen. So this story that's coming out of the New York Times makes no sense whatsoever. But then again, we have CNN and Washington Post saying they were hit by Syrian Electronic Army, which they're building the case for this war coming up in Syria. Now, Google and Amazon both have a mysterious blackout. Google went out for, I think it was like 30 minutes, and Amazon also went down for US and Canada. Unexplained, something strange, doesn't make sense. But let's take this a step further now. Now, in the United Kingdom, they're saying that cyber attacks could be the next major banking crisis. A new report on the UK's banking sector warns that the next systemic shock could be in its inability to protect against a cyber attack. The next major crisis to affect the UK's banking sector could be cyber attacks, according to a new report. So, what they're saying is banks might be hit during a cyber attack, and this could spur off into a major financial crisis. But there is a new warning from the FBI Cyber Division. This was given to the private sector advisory, and this was from the FBI, and this plays into what is going to happen this fall with everything that I discussed in my episode which was on Friday, which was episode 138. And if you haven't heard that, you can play that. And this also goes with the drill that is happening in November on the power grid and the infrastructure of the electrical works. Now, the FBI, and I'll read this to you, the FBI's Cyber Division has issued a private sector advisory regarding a possible cyber-related threat to U.S.-based and foreign financial institution websites on or about September 11th, 2013. So what we're seeing here is everything building up for what is going to happen during this period. For those people who haven't, at this time, taken some money out of the bank, I would start to do it now. I discussed this in episode 138, that if you do not take your money out now, just like the people in Cyprus, when you wake up, you will not be able to. If you haven't started purchasing any silver or gold, I would start doing it. If you haven't purchased water, batteries, have medication that you need, I would get extra if you have some type of disease, or not disease, some type of ailment, high blood pressure, or anything that you might need extra medication, I would do that right now. I would get toiletries. I would get extra toilet paper. I would get something that would dissolve your waste, because we might not be able to flush our toilets. We don't know what this event's going to be, but from everything that I'm telling you, something is going to happen. And it's better to be prepared with food, water, extra medication, weapons, batteries, solar lights, cash on hand in your home. Keep your generators filled up. Keep your gas tank filled up in your car. Have extra fuel just in case. What's the worst thing? Nothing happens and you have all this stuff. Or you're prepared when something happens. And I do believe with what is going on and everything that they're preparing for and everything that I'm showing you, something is about to happen. Listen, everyone, be well, be safe, and especially be prepared. Thanks a lot.